Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud, Daf 10 of Masechta Beitzah. We're going to start out today talking about just like different scenarios about Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel and who's Machmir and who's Mekil. Whatever. That's like where we start. And then we get talking about setting aside birds. Like the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about how exactly to set aside birds, and what if you come back the next day and the birds that you set aside are different? Can you use them? Can you not use them? Those kinds of exciting things. We're going to start on Daf Tesam Beis. We got a little bit of work to do, but just because once we start over here, we're not really going to be able to break up the flow until really halfway through Yud Amud Aleph. So that's why we're going to start a little bit high up on Tesam Beis, but let's jump in. So it's about, I'd say, 10 lines before it gets wide. So we had said in our Mishnah that Beis Hillel says that you're allowed to chop a ladder and bring it from one dovecote to the next dovecote. And Beis Shammai said that you're not allowed to take the ladder from one dovecote to the next dovecote, but you can tilt it from one window to the next. So we see that Beis Hillel is the more lenient opinion, that you can bring the ladder from mamish one dovecote to another dovecote, and Beis Shammai says that no, you can't. You can only lean it from one window to the next. And what exactly is a dovecote? A dovecote, I don't know. Let's imagine it to be almost like a dove hotel, right? That it's this thing that has a few floors, and each floor has multiple rooms, and each room has a nest, and the doves kind of occupy their own room. So, fine. So we see that by Simchas Yom Tiv, that being able to chop a bird for lunch, Beis Shammai is being more stringent and saying you can only tilt the ladder from one window to the next, essentially from one hotel room to the next. And Beis Hillel says you can even chop it from one dovecote, from one hotel to the other hotel. So we see that Beis Shammai is being stringent and Beis Hillel is being lenient. But if we look back to the first Mishnah of Masechta Beitzah, but if we look at the first Mishnah of Masechta Beitzah, so we find the opposite is true. That Beis Shammai says, yeah, no problem, you could slaughter an animal on Yom Tiv and then just dig up a shtickle dirt, do kisei adam, no problem. Beis Hillel is the one who says, no, you have to have the dirt prepared from before Yom Tiv. So over there, Beis Shammai is being lenient, and Beis Hillel is being stringent. So Rabbi Yochanan says, all right, easy. Flip it around. Over here in our Mishnah, by the dovecotes, flip it around. Beis Hillel is the one who says that you're merely allowed to tilt the ladder from one window to the next, from one hotel room kilu to the next. And Beis Shammai says that you're allowed to bring the ladder mamish from one dovecote to the next. So Beis Shammai is the lenient one, Beis Hillel is the stringent one. V'fekta Gemara, mimai. How come we have to say that we have to flip around the opinions, that our Mishnah over here is inaccurate, that we have to flip around and say that Beis Hillel is being the stringent one, Beis Shammai is being the lenient one? Dumad kan lekami Beis Shammai also. Maybe the only reason why Beis Shammai says over there that by shchita, no problem, you could slaughter the animal and do kisei adam, dig up a shtickle dirt. Notes. We said, 2 days ago, that Beis Shammai would only say that you're allowed to do kisei adam, right, and dig up a shtickle dirt when you had already a spade stuck into the ground from before Yom Tiv. That there's no chafira, you're not doing any plowing. The melacha of chofer. But if there wasn't specifically a spade stuck into the ground already, you wouldn't be allowed to do kisei adam. So, meaning you wouldn't be allowed to slaughter the animal and do the kisei adam if you didn't already have a spade stuck into the ground. So we see that Beis Shammai isn't being particularly radical. They're just saying look, there's really nothing to be concerned about. I mean, the spade's already stuck into the ground. You just have to remove the dirt and put it on to the blood. It's not that big of a deal. But if that wasn't the case, there was no spade stuck into the ground, then you wouldn't be able to do You would not be allowed to slaughter the animal. You would not be allowed to do kisui adam. And therefore, in this case, where there's a real concern by the latter that maybe you're going to end up fixing your roof, or that people are going to think they're going to be fixing your roof, they're going to say, look, there's no reason to be lenient, and therefore they're going to be stringent. Or maybe you could say that the only reason why Beis Hillel is willing to be lenient over here by the dovecotes is because the ladder is specifically in the context of dovecotes. You have a ladder, by one dovecote. They want to bring over to another dovecote. It's clear that we're talking about dovecote ladders. We're not talking about fixing your roof. But that's not the case by slaughtering of the animal, where you might end up doing malacha of kotesh, maybe there's real issues of melacha over there. So therefore we basically say that we can explain it away, right? Meaning it's not necessarily that you can't necessarily view it in like that global way and just kind of say like, well, how could it be that Beis Shammai is being lenient in one place and stringent in the other, or Beis Hillel is being stringent in one place and lenient in the other? There's ways that we can sort of explain why they hold their respective opinions. Eli kasha or kasha. But if you're going to ask this question, this is the question you got to ask. We're going to learn in the next Mishnah that's coming up today that you can only chop birds from the dovecote on yuntif for lunch if you already picked them up before yuntif starts. That according to Beis Shammai, before yuntif starts, you would have to go to the dovecote, chop one bird, chop another bird, and pick them up and say, these are the two birds that I want to eat for lunch on Yom Tov. And by doing so, by having picked them up, he basically indicates that he's definitely going to be using these two birds, and he's setting them aside for use for lunch. Beis Hillel says you don't need to be so drastic. You don't have to mamish chop them and pick them up. Rather, it's enough to just look at them and say, you lunch. Okay. So we see that when it comes to Simchas Yom Tov, when it comes to enjoying a meal on Yom Tov, so Beis Shammai is being stringent, saying, yeah, mamash have to pick them up, and unless you pick them up, it's not enough of an indication that these are the birds that you want. Whereas Beis Hillel says that it's enough to just verbally indicate. So they're being lenient. But what about the fact that our original Mishnah, our first Mishnah had said that Beis Shammai is the more lenient opinion that says that you're allowed to slaughter the animal and do kisei adam, whereas Beis Hillel says you're not allowed to. So Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, no problem, just switch around the shitas when it comes to the birds and say that Beis Hillel is the stringent one and Beis Shammai is the lenient one. And maybe that's not the case. Maybe we shouldn't flip them around. Maybe Beis Shammai only is lenient in the first Mishnah because there's specifically already a spade stupped in the ground. But if there wasn't already a spade stupped into the ground and that we wouldn't have to worry about chofer, so maybe they wouldn't be lenient over there, and therefore we can't just necessarily globally view them as the lenient opinion. Maybe the only reason why Beis Hillel says over here that you're allowed to just verbally indicate which birds you want is because at the end of the day, we're just talking about muktzah over here, which is a din d'Rabbanan. Aval awesome lo, but when it comes to shchita and chofer and kotesh and all these different, mamas melachas, maybe, right? I can understand why you wouldn't want to be lenient. Okay. Also, we can't necessarily just view Beis Hillel as the globally lenient opinion over here, because maybe there's a reason why he's lenient, which is because we're only talking about muktzah at the end of the day anyways. So I can explain why Beis Shammai holds their respective opinions and Beis Hillel holds their respective opinions. Eli kasha or kasha. But rather, if you want to ask a question, ask the following question. Beis Shammai Eli likatziv olav basar. Beis Shammai says that you're not allowed to take a pestle in order to chop up meat on the pestle. Beis Hillel matirin, whereas Beis Hillel says it's fine, you're allowed to chop a pestle and chop up meat on it. A pestle is like a mortar and a pestle. It's like this heavy thing that you use to smash spices and stuff in a mortar, and I guess you can also technically chop meat on it, I guess. Okay? So we see that Beis Shammai says don't chop the pestle, and Beis Hillel says you can chop the pestle. So Amma gav Simchas Yom Tov Beis Shammai lechumra, Beis Hillel lekula. So we see that by Simchas Yom Tov, being able to chop up meat for Yom Tov, Beis Shammai is being stringent and saying that you're not allowed to chop the pestle. Beis Hillel is being lenient and saying that you are allowed to chop the pestle. But what about our first Mishnah that says that Beis Shammai says you're allowed to slaughter the animal and do kisei adam? Beis Hillel says that you're not. So we see that Beis Shammai is taka the lenient opinion, and Beis Hillel is the stringent one. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Pashit, switch around the opinions and say that Beis Shammai is the one who says that you are allowed to chop the pestle, and Beis Hillel says that you're not. Dumaloi, to which the Gemara says, wait, how do you know? Maybe the only reason why Beis Shammai is lenient in the first Mishnah is because there's already a spade stooped in the ground. But if there wasn't already a spade stooped in the ground, maybe they wouldn't say that you're allowed to slaughter the animal and do kisui hadam and dig up the dirt. So we see, right, it's only because the spade was stooped in the ground. So there might not be necessarily the globally lenient opinion. It just happens to make sense in that first Mishnah. Maybe the only reason why Beis Hillel says that you're allowed to chop the pestle to chop meat on it is because it's already a kli, and you want to use it l'tzorech gufo, right? You want to, eina chinami, that generally this kli would be a kli shemlachto le'isser. It would be for grinding up spices and stuff, which we wouldn't want to do. Or grinding up other things which you wouldn't want to do. So, but over here you want to use it for meat. So therefore Beis Hillel says it's taka okay. But over there, in the first Mishnah, where you might end up doing like an Isser Shabbos, they would say that's why it doesn't work. Eli kasha or kasha. Rather, if you want to ask the question, ask the following question: Beis Shammai says, don't put, if you have a raw hide, don't lay it on the ground for people to be able to step on it, because that would be like a step in the process of tanning the hide. So don't put it out for people to step on it. And don't pick it up unless it has a kazayis of meat on it, because otherwise it will be muktzah. Beis Hillel says that you're allowed to use it. So we see that when it comes to Simchas Yom Tif, enjoying Yom Tif, being able to put out this mat, right. Well, I think the Simchas Yom Tov aspect over here is that, well, if you're not allowed to do anything with the hide, then you might not end up slaughtering the animal, in which case you're going to refrain from Simchas Yom Tov. So we see that in order to encourage you to slaughter animals and enjoy Yom Tov, Beis Hillel is going to allow you to be lenient to and allow you to put out the hide, whereas Beis Shammai is stringent and says that you're not allowed to put out the hide. But we see that the opposite is true in our first Mishnah, that Beis Shammai is the one that's being lenient and saying that you're allowed to slaughter an animal and dig up some dirt and do kisei adam, whereas Beis Hillel says you're not allowed to. So Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, just switch it around and say that Beis Hillel says that you're not allowed to put out the hide, and Beis Shammai says that you are allowed to put out the hide. Mimai? So which the Gemara says, how come we have to switch around the opinions? Dilma, maybe I can explain everyone's opinions. Maybe the only reason why Beis Shammai says in the first Mishnah that you're allowed to do the kisei adam, you're allowed to slaughter the animal and do kisei adam, is because you already have a spade stooped in the ground, so you don't have to worry about chofer. But if there was no spade already stooped in the ground, so then you wouldn't be allowed to slaughter the animal and do kisei adam. So it makes sense why Beis Shammai would say that you're allowed to slaughter the animal and do kisei adam, because you already have the spade already stooped in the ground. Maybe the only reason why Beis Hillel says over here by the hide that you're allowed to spread it out, because you could sit on it. There's a use for it. You could sit on it. But in the case of the slaughtering the animal, there isn't necessarily any reason to be lenient and say that you'd be allowed to slaughter the animal and dig up the ground to do kisei adam. Rather, if you're going to ask a question, ask it from the following. That Beis Shammai says that you're not allowed to remove the like shutters from the stores on Yom Tov, and Beis Hillel says not only can you remove them, you can even put them back. What does that mean? It means that the stores that they would have would be like these like cubicles or whatever that they would have in Rosh Hashanah, and there would be like a shutter on it that I guess that would be the entrance into the cubicle. And what they would do is they would remove the shutter, and then that was the table that they would put out their wares on. So Beis Shammai says that you're not allowed to remove the shutter from the cubicle on Yom Tif in order to put out your wares, because technically you can buy things from the people on Yom Tif as long as you're not discussing price. So, if you can just, let's say, go to the store and say, hey, can I have some eggs or spices or whatever? Well, eggs is a touchy subject. If you go and say, look, can I have some spices or whatever? So then he can give it to you on Yom Tif, no problem, as long as you don't discuss money. So Beis Shammai says you're not allowed to take off these shutters in order to like open up the store, essentially. Where am I? Vesil says not only are you allowed to remove the shutter in order to be able to put out your wares so that people can buy what they need for Yom Tif, you can even put it back. So we see that by Simchas Yom Tif, in order to enable people to be to enjoy Yom Tif and be able to have the spices or whatever else that they need from the merchants on Yom Tif, Beis Hillel is being lenient and saying so that people could buy their things. The merchants can remove the shutters and put out their wares and stuff like that, and even put back the shutters afterwards, so that to make sure that people aren't gonna want to open up their stores if they're not going to be able to close them afterwards. So in order to enable and facilitate Simchas Yom Tov, Beis Hillel says is lenient and says that you're allowed to remove the shutters and even put them back on the stores. V'ramini. What do we do about the first Mishnah, where Beis Shammai seems to be the lenient opinion? It says that you're allowed to slaughter animals and dig up ground to do kisei adam. Beis Hillel says that you're not. So Beis Shammai notes. I understand how you can explain Beis Shammai. Okay, Beis Shammai says in the first Mishnah that you're allowed to slaughter the animal and do kisei adam because you already had the spade stuffed in the ground. And over here you don't, right? But if you didn't have the spade stuffed in the ground, you wouldn't be allowed to. And over here, there's no reason to say. Right, they're unwilling to say that he's allowed to, just remove and put back the shutters, because they hold that there is binyan b'kelim and stira b'kelim. That, you wouldn't be allowed to, with kelim, with the shutters, it would be considered boneh if they would put up the shutters, and stira if they would take it down. So therefore, they say you're not allowed to. Beis Hillel, kasha. But how do you explain Beis Hillel? How come in the first Mishnah they're saying that you're not allowed to slaughter the animal and do kisei and dig up the ground for kisei adam, yet over here they seem to be saying that you're allowed to remove and put back the shutters? Rabbi Yochanan says, well, switch it around. That Beis Hillel is actually the stringent opinion, Beis Shammai is the lenient opinion. To which the Gemara says, wait, maybe we don't have to switch or anything around. Maybe the only reason why Beis Hillel says over here that you're allowed to remove and put back the shutters is because they hold that there's no binyan b'kelim, there's no stira b'kelim. So technically speaking, you're not really doing anything wrong by removing and putting back the shutters. And in order to facilitate Simchas Yom Tov, happiness on Yom Tov, they would say that you're allowed to remove and put back the shutters. So we tried to kind of ask all of these kind of questions, right, against the respective opinions of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, based on assumptions, like sort of these global assumptions that Beis Shammai is being lenient and Beis Hillel is being stringent, and then we have these other cases where Beis Hillel is being lenient and Beis Shammai is being stringent, and we essentially explain away each of the cases to explain why we might be able to explain why each opinion holds what they hold in each particular case, and it doesn't necessarily conflict with some global kind of approach about being lenient and stringent. All right, friends, we're moving on. We're getting to a new Mishnah, the third Mishnah of Masechta Beitzah. Discussing about how exactly to set aside birds for your lunch on Yom Tov. And we're going to get into a shtickle sugya of breira, which comes up every so often. So here we go. As we actually saw a few minutes ago in the context of all those, cases that were being brought to ask kashas against the leniency and stringency of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So it says the Mishnah, Beis Shammai lo yitel elam ken nenami ba'od yom. Says Beis Shammai, if you want to be able on Yom Tov to go to your Dovecote hotel and chop 2 birds for lunch, you will have had to have already before Yom Tiv gone to the dovecote and gone over to the two birds that you specifically plan to eat tomorrow, pick them up, and say, I'm going to eat you. Whereas, Beitzah says Beitzah, Omed v'Omer zev zani notel. Beitzah, it says you don't quite have to go that far. It's enough to just kind of verbally indicate, okay, you, lunch. Okay. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Chanan bar Ami, Machlokas bebricha rishona. Says Rav Chanan bar Ami that the machlokas is in the first brood. Friends, we're going to learn something about doves. Apparently doves, they lay, I guess, 2 chicks every month of the year, 1 male and 1 female. And this is true for every month of the year except for the winter. So between Teves and Nisan, for those 3 months, no chicks. But the other 9 months, every month, they lay 2 eggs, 1 male, 1 female. Now, the first brood, I guess it's the first, I guess after the winter break, the first sort of pair that is laid. So generally, the people would leave those chicks for the dove, for the mother. And then they would chop sort of the rest of the eggs, the other months. So, that's what's called the first brood. So, Rav Chanan bar Ami, machlokas b'bricha rishona. That the machlokas here about do you actually have to pick them up or is verbalizing enough? So that's only by the first brood where, generally you wouldn't take the first brood. So maybe you would, so if you decide that you want to eat them, I mean, it's tricky because, if we're saying that the first brood is Nisan and Pesach, Yom Tif corresponds with Nisan. So, you might want to chop those birds for lunch on Yom Tif. So because generally speaking, you would leave these birds for the mother dove. So that is why Beis Shammai says you specifically have to pick them up, because we want to make sure that, by picking them up, you're no longer going to change your mind. You already picked them up and did something to indicate that you really do plan on eating them. The Beis Shammai says you have to pick up these birds because otherwise we're concerned that if you didn't already pick them up before Yom Tif and be determined to go ahead and eat them the next day, you might change your mind on Yom Tif, right? What might end up happening is if you didn't go through the act of actually picking it up before Yom Tif, so then on Yom Tif, what might end up happening is that you'll pick up the birds in order to chop them, and then you'll change your mind, say, you know what, I'm going to leave them. Which means that then you pick them up for no reason on Yom Tif. And in order to prevent that from happening, Beis Shammai says, if you, the day before, pick them up, indicate, and say, I'm going to eat you, and then you put them down, and you still come back the next day to follow through, so then you're definitely going to do that. And we're not concerned that you're going to pick them up and then change your mind. Beitzah says, meh, we're not concerned. It's enough to just say, you, I'm going to eat you, and then you kind of come back the next day and chop them. We're not concerned that you're going to end up, picking them up and putting them down, and muktzah, fine. But once already you get to the second month, once already you get to the second brood, where, it's not common practice to leave the doves for the mother, well, then even Beis Shammai would agree, you can just, so let's say Sukkot time, where already it's, the 7th brood or whatever, so you would be able to, even Beis Shammai would say, you can just kind of go up to the dovecote and be like, you, lunch, and go back home. Okay. Now, friends, we get into shtickle breira. So according to Beis Hillel, how come he needs to say, how come he needs to, even verbally, how come he still needs to say, you, I'm going to eat you? Where am I? Why can't he just say, from this dovecote, I'm going to chap lunch tomorrow? Why does he need to specify Reuven the bird and Shimon the bird, this is going to be lunch? Why isn't it enough to just say, look, I'm going to come to this dovecote and I'm going to chop 2 birds tomorrow? Which ones? We'll see. Well, maybe you'll suggest Beis Hillel doesn't hold the breira. Friends, we know what breira is. Breira is Photoshop. maybe you'll say, well, Beis Hillel doesn't hold a Breira, meaning that if we were to say Breira, so what it means is that, okay, so in advance, if we do hold a Breira, so what you'd be able to do is show up to the Dovkot before Yom Tif, say, all right, from this Dovkot, I'm going to be chapping 2 birds tomorrow for lunch. And then the next day on Yom Tif, you come to the Dovkot, you chap your 2 birds, and Memele, retroactively, will Photoshop it in and say that when he came the day before, these 2 birds that he's holding right now are the 2 birds that he intended the day before. That's how it works. If we could say, right, Breira. We go back in time and say, Memele, the 2 birds that he's holding in his hand right now are the 2 birds that he wanted, that yesterday he intended to chap today. But if you don't hold a Breira, well then, if he comes to the Dovkot the day before and just says, look, I'm going to chap 2 birds, well then who's to say that the 2 birds that he ends up chapping are the 2 birds that he intended to chap? Because we can't go back in time and say these 2 birds that he's holding right now are the ones that he intended. If you don't hold a Breira, so then there's no guarantee that the 2 birds that he's holding right now technically are the ones that he had in mind the day before when he said, I'm going to chap 2 birds. Ho ho. So if you're going to say the reason why Beitzah says that you have to specify Reuven the bird and Shimon the bird is because he doesn't hold the Breira, and therefore you have to in advance stipulate which birds you're going to chap. But that's not true. Beitzah does hold a Breira. We learn in a Mishnah, friends. Mishnah in Oalos. Oof. Fun stuff. Habeis babayis, v'lo psochim harbe. Fun sugya of sof tumalotzis. Ho ho. You have a house, a 1-room house with 4 walls, and it's like the tent of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu, right? They say that on all 4 sides of his tent there was a door so that he can invite in guests, b'machnes orchim, from all 4 sides. So now this house was a 1-room house with 4 walls, and each wall had a door. And in the house there was a corpse. Now the corpse is going to have to exit the house from one of the doors. We don't know which one, but one of them. Now, if there are vessels in each of the doorways, so then we have to assume that the vessels under each of the doorways are going to be tameh, because since the mace is going to have to exit this house from one of the doorways, we don't know which one, so therefore we have to assume that the mace can be going out of any of the doorways, and therefore any vessels that are under any of the doorways are going to be tameh of tumas oel, because in the event that the mace exits through that particular door, so then it will be making the doorways going to be making an ohel over the mace during that time, and therefore any of the kalim underneath, in that doorway are going to become tameh, because we don't know which doorway this mace is going to be going out, so therefore the kalim in all of the doorways are tameh. So again, a mace b'bayis, if you have a mace in a house, v'lo p'sachim harbe, and there's several doors in the house, kulan tmeim, so the vessels under all of the doors are tameh, because we don't know which doorway the mace is going to go out through. Niftach echod meyen. Now, if now one of the doors gets opened, well then, hu tameh v'chulin torin. Well then we can assume that at least from this point on, this is the door that the mace is going to be exiting from. And therefore certainly at least any vessels that would now show up at any of the other doors from this point onwards would not become tameh tumas oel, because we know that we can assume that the mace is now going to be going out of the door that is open. What about the vessels from beforehand? Do they become okay lemafreya retroactively? Certainly not clear. But definitely from the time that the doorway is open, we can assume that the mace is going to be going out the open door, and any vessels that showed up at the other doors from now on would be tahor. What about the vessels that were already there? It's certainly at least not clear. Fine. If the fellow had intention, he didn't necessarily open any of the doors physically, but he had intention, I'm going to take out the mace through the northern door, let's say. So, or through a window that's 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim. Matzelis al kol psachim. So by having simply intention to remove the mace through one of the doors, so then that's enough to say, okay, well, the mace is going to be taken out of that particular door, and all of the other doors, the vessels underneath them are tahor. Fine. So Matzel Sakol Psachim Kulin. Beishame Omrim, Vushachashav Lotzio Ad Shali Amos Hamis. Now Beishame says that, however, only works, the intention thing only works if he had this intention before the mace passed away. That if before the person passed away, he had intention, I'm going to be taking out the mace to, let's say, the northern door, so then that works, and we can assume that he's going to be taking out the mace to the northern door. Vesila Omrim, right, and all the other doors are tahor. Vesila Omrim, Vesila say af mishiyam musames. Even if it's after the mace passes away, we could still retroactively say that that was the door that he intended. And therefore, Kilu says, Beis Hillel, that even if later on he had the intention that, he wants to be taking out the kelim through the northern door, so then Memele already retroactively will say Breira, and will say that all of the vessel, right, that this was the door that he intended to be taking out the mace through, and then only that doorway would be tummy, the other ones would be tahor. So we see from here that Beis Hillel seems to be holding a prayer, right? That even if after the mace passed away, he had intention that he says, look, his intention is that he's going to be taking out the mace to the northern door, let's say. So then that's the door that he intended all along. And only the kelim under the northern door would be tummy. So we see that Beis Hillel does hold a prayer. Hoyit marala, to which the Gemara says not necessarily. Didn't we teach about it? Amar Rabba says Rabba l'tayres apsochim mikanu lahaba. But that's no. When Beis Hillel says that even after the mace passes away, you would be able to say, okay, this is my intention to remove the mace through, let's say, the northern door. That is only going to help from this point on. But any vessels in the other doorways that were tameh until this point are going to remain tameh. Things that kind of come to those other doorways after the fact would be tahor at this point. But it doesn't work retroactively. Therefore, you cannot necessarily say breira. Also, Boshai says the same thing, which is that when Beis Hillel says that, even if after the mace passes away, you could have intention to take the mace out of a particular door, that's only going to work from this point on, but it's not going to work retroactively. And Beis Shammai is going to say, no, even from this point on, it doesn't work, right? If once the mace passes away, intention isn't going to work at all. Once the mace passes away, even to save things from this point on, you would have to specifically, as we said earlier in the Mishnah, open a door. And by doing something, by opening the door, only that allows things from this point on to be tahor at the other doorways. Okay, fine. But according to Rabbah and Rabbi Oshaya, Beis Hillel does not hold a prayer. When Beis Hillel says that even after the mace passes away, you can have intention for which door you want to take the mace out of, that works to prevent new things that show up at the other doors from becoming tameh. But it won't go back retroactively and make the things at the other doors tahor, and therefore Beis Hillel does not hold of breira, and that would explain why in our Mishnah they would say that you have to say, I want Reuven the bird and Shimon the bird. It's not enough to just say, I'm going to chop 2 birds tomorrow. Because you can't assume breira. Ravi Omar says, Ravi l'olam l'mafreya, really, actually, when Beis Hillel says that even after the mace passes away, you can have intention, that actually is retroactively. And actually, all of the vessels in the other doorways retroactively become tahor, because we do hold a breira. So if that's the case, then why does he have to specify Reuven the bird and Shimon the bird? Rava says, but the issue over here is different. It's an issue of muksa. That if you just say, I'm going to chop 2 birds, so memela, sure, if he shows up tomorrow and chops 2 birds, so we could say breira, we could say retroactively, these are the birds that he had an intention for from the beginning. Sure, we could do that. That would be breira, that would be fine. But we have a different concern. That if he didn't specifically say, I want Reuven the bird and Shimon the bird, we're concerned that he's going to show up at the nest on yuntif to chap lunch, and he's going to pick up one bird and say, you could probably have a better one. Picks up the next one, he says, alright, this is a little better, but I could probably find a better one. He ends up picking, it's like, you touch it, you eat it kind of thing. We're concerned that he's not such a, you touch it, you eat it kind of guy. And therefore he's going to he's going to touch all the birds, pick them all up, figure out which one he wants. And he ended up moving all the birds, and he didn't, and there was no reason to pick up all the birds because he's not going to be eating most of them. So therefore, again, this is the reason why he has to specify in advance that he wants to take Reuven the bird and Shimon the bird, because because unless he specifies which birds he wants in advance, we're concerned that he might pick up all of them. And then he's going to end up picking up ones and putting them down, things that weren't fit for him, because he's not going to end up eating them. He's only going to be ending up taking 2 of them anyways. So even though Memela, the 2 that he takes retroactively, we could say Breira and say that these are the ones that he intended, but what about along the way when he was picking up all of them, putting them down for no reason? That's a problem. To which the Gemara says, yeah, but still, what's our solution? That he just stands from a distance and says, Reuven and Shimon, I'm going to eat you? That's not exactly, he's still, what'll happen? What'll happen if he shows up and it turns out that Reuven and Shimon weren't all that they amounted to be. From a distance, they looked a lot more geschmack than they did from up close. So even according to Rava, I understand Beis Shammai, okay, you pick them up and Mama should do something to indicate they're going to chop them, but what's your solution, Rava? From a distance, he's just going to say, okay, Reuven, Shimon. So he still might end up picking up all of them if he finds that they're not so geschmack. So Animili me'erev yomtiv. So the Gemara answers, yeah, it is enough, because as long as already from erev yomtiv he goes to the dovecote and he says, look, Reuven, Shimon, the birds, I'm going to eat you for lunch. It's a very special zchus to be a yomtiv meal. And then in that case we can assume that he's going to go ahead and chop Reuven and Shimon the bird, no matter what. But if he doesn't specify in advance Reuven and Shimon the bird, and he just says, I'm going to chop 2 birds, well then also it's not allowed, because maybe the ones that he, thought in advance ended up being, he thought they were going to be fat, but they ended up being skinny, or he thought that they were going to be skinny, they ended up being fat, right? The ones that looked skinny are now fat. He's going to end up moving things around and touching things that he's not supposed to, that he's not going to end up taking. Or if he doesn't specifically say that he wants to eat Reuven the bird and Shimon the bird, maybe he's just going to go to chop 2 birds, and in the end, to his regret, to his disappointment, he's going to find that all of the birds actually look kind of shvach. And therefore he's just not going to take anything. And he's going to lose out. He's not going to have simchas yomtiv. So to prevent that, we say, look, if on erev yomtiv, he goes to the dovecote and he says, look, Reuven the bird, Shimon the bird, I'm going to eat you for lunch. So then, memele, we can kind of feed 2 birds with 1 seed. Basically, we're not concerned that he's going to end up picking up and putting down other birds, because he already specified Reuven and Shimon. And secondly, we're not concerned that he's going to find that none of them are good and he's just going to walk away and not have simchas yomtiv. We're not concerned about any of these things, because once he specifies Reuven the bird and Shimon the bird, he's going to eat them. Very nice. Alright friends, moving on in Shas. We got another Mishnah. Zimin shchorim u'matz levanim u'matz shchorim. Givaldik. What if on erev yomtiv he says, Reuven the bird, Shimon the bird, I'm going to eat you tomorrow. And Reuven and Shimon are blackbirds. And then he comes back the next day, and all of a sudden Reuven and Shimon are white birds. Or what if it was the opposite? Reuven and Shimon were white birds, and he comes back tomorrow and they're blackbirds. And he's very, very confused. What if all of a sudden Levi the bird joins Reuven and Shimon? Now there are 3 of them. Asurim. In all of those cases, you're not allowed to eat these birds anymore. But if on erev yomtiv there was Reuven, Shimon, and Levi the birds, and he said, I'm going to eat all of you guys, and then one of them is gone, so he's allowed to eat the 2 remaining ones. What if on Erev Yom Tif, Reuven and Shimon were inside their hotel room, and then the next day he comes to the Dove Hotel and he finds them on their balcony? Asurin. You're not allowed to eat them. But if they're the only show in town, they're the only birds around, and they were inside the hotel room the day before, and now today they're outside the hotel room, we can assume it's the same birds. Pshita. The Gemara says, obviously, if Reuven and Shimon were blackbirds, and then tomorrow all of a sudden they're white birds, mistama, they're not Reuven and Shimon. So obviously then you can't eat them. They're not the ones that you set aside, they're different birds. So says Rabbah, well, here we're talking about where he set aside Reuven and Shimon, blackbirds, right? So going back to the metaphor of the hotel, so this Dove hotel, let's say it has 3 floors, and each floor has a bunch of hotel rooms. So in room 1A is Reuven and Shimon, the blackbirds. In room 1B, next door to them, is Levi and Yehuda, which are white birds. So now, here we're talking about, so he set aside blackbirds and white birds. In room 1A were Reuven and Shimon, the blackbirds, and in room 1B were Levi and Yehuda, the white birds. And then he wakes up, and lo and behold, in room 1A, there are white birds, and in room 1B, there are blackbirds. And the question is, are these Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda? And the Gemara is saying, no, they're not. The Mishnah is saying, no, they're not. That's what it means, that if he sets aside white birds and he finds out that they're black, or blackbirds and he finds out that they're white, so he's not allowed to eat them. It's talking about, that they kind of, potentially just kind of swapped rooms, and still we're saying that they're different. You're not allowed to eat them. Ma'odatema may have thought, Hani inu ninu v'sapuche isapuch. I may have thought that these are all the same birds, they just switched rooms. Komash malon, hanach azdu la'ama v'ani achvine ninu. So what the Mishnah is teaching is that that's not the case. They didn't just switch rooms, rather they all flew away. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda all flew away, and they were replaced by 2 other white birds and 2 other blackbirds. So let's say that this is a support for Reb Chanina. That when you have to choose between a majority or proximity, you go after the majority. Meaning, we have 2 options in this case. What's the majority? So the majority is that, well, there's maybe millions, billions, trillions of birds in this world, of doves in this world, I don't know how many. Chances are, if you set aside blackbirds and also they're white birds, if we had to guess, Mistama, they came from called the Parish, Meruba Parish, right? Mistama, these 2 birds are from the millions, billions, trillions of doves in the world. They're not, from the dovecote that you're in. But the proximity argument would be, well, but then again, Reuven and Shimon, the blackbirds were in room 1A. Levi and Yehuda, the white birds, were in room 1B. Proximity would say that, well, they just probably swapped rooms. So therefore, says the Gemara, well, Reb Chanina has this principle of rov v'karov halechacha rov, that when you have to choose between a majority position or a proximity position, we go after the majority position. So then this would be a support for that we're assuming that these are birds that came from all of the multitudes of birds in the world, and not from the proximity of that they probably just swapped rooms. So this seems to be a support for Reb Chanina. So, and for the Gemara, not necessarily. Because Kedamar Abai B'daf Achonami B'daf. It's like Abai says it's talking about a board, and here also it's talking about a board, meaning the balcony. That the way that these dove hotels would work is that there are all these rooms, and in front of the rooms was every room had a balcony. And what would happen is the doves from the world, from the multitudes of doves, would come and hang out on the balcony. They wouldn't be allowed into the room because the doves who were occupying the room wouldn't let them. But they would hang out on the balcony, and then when the doves occupying the rooms left, these doves would move in. And therefore, proximity isn't necessarily to say that Reuven and Shimon the bird switched with Levi and Yehuda the bird who were next door. Proximity is also to say that maybe Reuven and Shimon left, and the birds that were hanging out on their balcony just kind of occupied their room afterwards. And therefore, both Rov and Karov are to indicate that maybe these are not the next door neighbor birds, but rather they're just random birds that flew in and were hanging out on the balcony and then took their room when they vacated. So therefore, in this case, there's both Rov and Karov are indicating that these are different birds, as opposed to Reb Chanina that would say Rov or Karov, and when you have Rov versus Karov, you go after the Rov. But over here, actually both Rov and Karov would indicate that these are other birds, and that is why we assume that they're other birds. The Mishnah had said that if you had set aside Reuven and Shimon the birds, and then you show up and Levi the bird is also there, so then you're not allowed to eat any of them. Because either way you look at it. If Reuven and Shimon flew away, and now this is Levi, Yehuda, and Yisachar, so then Memele, you didn't set them aside. Because they're different birds. And if Reuven and Shimon the bird are still there, and Levi joined them, well, one of them is, together with them, you don't know which one it is. We don't know which one's Levi, which one's the imposter, the intruder. And therefore, you can't have any of them. Tosfos asked a kasha, and maybe all of you asked a kasha, shouldn't we say it's Batal Barov? So, Tosfos gives two answers. And I usually don't look at Tosfos, but this was a very small Tosfos at the top of the page, and it was very easy Tosfos too. So Tosfos gives two answers. One is that, well, as we learned the other day, that when something is chashuv, it's not batal, and a live bird is considered chashuv, so it's not batal. Or we could say dover sheish lo matir, and we also said, right, something that can become permitted, after yuntif, so then it's not going to be batal. So therefore, you can't eat these birds. Shloshu matzah shnayim mutar. But said the Mishnah that if you had set aside 3 birds, and now you come back and there's 2 birds darting, so then they are permitted, because we just assume, right, that one of them flew away, and these 2 are 2 out of 3 of the ones that you had initially set aside. My time, so the answer is, well, because you set aside 3 birds, now you find 2 birds. Okay, these are 2 out of the 3 that you set aside. One of them just flew away, but you had already set these aside Memela. Leva mastis and Rebbe v'lo Rabbanan. So let's say that this Mishnah is the opinion of Rebbe as opposed to the rabbis. Now, we wouldn't really want to say that this Mishnah is the opinion of Rebbe and not the rabbis, because generally we have an opinion of Yochid v'Rab, Malachi Krab, that we go based on the majority. And as Rashi points out, even though we say Halacha Krebi Mechavero, that if you have machlokas between Rebbe and somebody else, we'll pass him like Rebbe, but Mechavero v'lo Mechaverov, from one person who is arguing with, but not with multiple people. So it wouldn't make sense to say that we're paskening in our Mishnah like Rebbe versus the rabbis. What are we talking about, Rebbe versus the rabbis? The Tanya. So we're learning a Beitzah. If a fellow had Meiser Sheni, and he transferred the value of the Meiser Sheni onto money, and he's going to take that money to Yerushalayim, and it was $100 worth of Meiser Sheni, and he put that $100, away in some box or something. He opens up the box, and now he finds that there are $200 over there, and he's confused. He says, wait, I don't understand. What? I thought I only had $100 here. So, so Rebbe says, what this is $100 of it is the Meiser Sheni that you put there, and the other $100, I don't know, it's chulin. It's just regular money. So half of it is the Meiser Sheni money that you put there. Half of it is chulin money that got mixed in. Whereas the Chacham say no. This is not what we are experiencing over here. What we are experiencing over here is that you had removed the Meiser Sheni money and put it somewhere else, and you don't remember. And this is a separate $200, because Meiser Sheni money you'd be very careful about, and you wouldn't just add another $100 to Meiser Sheni money. Rather, what would happen is, if you wanted to, change this money or something, you would take the $100 of Meiser Sheni, put it somewhere else, and then you put a completely separate $200 over here. And therefore, the $200 that you're seeing over here are entirely chulin, and they're entirely different than the $100 of Meiser Sheni that you put there initially. And if you had initially put in $200 worth of Meiser Sheni money, and he comes back and finds $100 worth of Meiser Sheni, $100 over there. So Rebbe says, look, the $100 that you see is 100 of the $200 of Meiser Sheni, and you took 100 of them. I don't know why, but you did. So you initially had $200 of Meiser Sheni there. Now you find $100. Okay, that's 100 of the $200. I don't know what you did with the other $100, but this $100 is $100 of Meiser Sheni money. Whereas the Chacham said, just like earlier, they said, look, you wouldn't just take Meiser Sheni money, half of your Meiser Sheni money. Rather, what must have happened is that you took the $200 of Meiser Sheni, put it somewhere else, and then this is a separate $100 that's entirely chulin. And therefore, friends, how does this tie into our Mishnah? The way it ties into our Mishnah is that just like Rebbe says that if you have $200 of Meiser Sheni and you come back and find $100, so we assume, okay, this $100 is at least 100 of the $200. Whereas Chacham say, no, this $100 is entirely different. It's entirely a separate $100. I don't know what happened to the $200 of Meiser Sheni, but this is entirely chulin. So therefore, if we apply that to our birds, that when you initially set aside 3 birds, and now you find 2 birds, so if we say, okay, one of them flew away, and these 2 are 2 out of the initial 3, that's like Rebbe, who says that the $100 that you're finding is 100 of the initial $200. The Chacham would say that the $200 entirely went away, and it was replaced by $100 of chulin. So they should say in our Mishnah that if you set aside 3 and find 2, so Memela, the first 3 all flew away, and these are a separate 2. So from the fact that we're saying that we're just assuming that one of them flew away, and these 2 are 2 out of the initial 3, that must be like Rebbe, who says that the $100 that you're finding is 100 of the initial $200. So answer the Gemara, Afilutema Rabbanon. You can even say that our Mishnah is like the rabbis, that the rabbis would agree that when you set aside 3 birds and now you find 2, that these 2 are 2 out of the original 3, because Hayitmar Allah, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar Damitabayu, that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar both say about this, Shaini gozalos ho'vasuyin lidados, that birds are different because they move around. Birds don't stand still, they move around, and therefore it makes sense to assume that if you had 3 birds and now there's 2, one of them just kind of like hopped away, and the 2 that you're seeing are 2 out of the 3 originals. Masha Einkin by money. Money's not going anywhere. Therefore, if you had $200 somewhere, and now you find $100, clearly you took it. And if you took it, you wouldn't just take 100 of the $200 of Meiser Sheni money. It's Meiser Sheni money. Memele, you took all of the Meiser Sheni money, put it somewhere else, and you don't remember doing it, and now this $100 that you're seeing here is a separate $100. But by birds, you can assume it's the same birds, and one of them just hopped away. But fact the Gemara, why are we saying that both Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan say that the reason why you're allowed to, right, you can assume that these 2 birds are 2 out of the 3 originals because one of them just hopped away, because birds hop away. But one second, in the context of the Meiser Sheni money, it was taught to Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar that there's a machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar over there. That Chad Omar, one of them says, B'shnei kisin machlokas, that the machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim is specifically when there's 2 separate wallets. That if you had 2 wallets in the box, one of them had $100 of Meiser Sheni, the other one had $100 of Meiser Sheni, that's where there's a machlokas. That is where Rebbe is going to say that you can assume that now if you find that there's only 1 wallet there, Rebbe is going to say, okay, somebody must have just chapped one of the wallets. There were 2 separate wallets, somebody must have chapped one. But if all the money, if all $200 were in 1 wallet, everyone would agree, okay, somebody chapped that wallet with the $200 in it and replaced it with a separate wallet with $100, and it's chulin. And the other, either Rabbi Yochanan or Rabbi Elazar, the other way to understand it is b'kis echad machlokas, that the machlokas between Rebbe and the Chacham is when the money is all in 1 wallet. Aval b'shnei kisin, but if it was in 2 wallets, everyone would agree, even the Chacham would agree, that if you had 2 wallets, $100 in each wallet, and now you come back and there's only $100 there, even the Chacham would agree, okay, somebody just chapped one of the wallets, and the $100 that's remaining is Meiser Sheni money. Okay, so now, so I understand why we would have to say that both Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan say that birds are different because they move around, and therefore one of them just kind of moved around, and the other two remaining are the birds that you set aside. So if you say that the machlokes between Rebbe and the Chachamim by the Meiser Sheni money is when they're two separate wallets, that even when they're $100 in this wallet and $100 in the other wallet, the Chachamim still say that if you come back and find a wallet with $100 in it, that it's entirely chulin, that somebody chab both wallets and replaced them with one wallet with $100, and it's chulin. Well then, if we're going to compare that to the three separate birds, so then we would have to, and if one of them goes away, I'd have to assume that they all went away and they got replaced with two separate birds, to which we had to answer no. When it comes to birds, because they hop around, they're not comparable to wallets. Birds hop around, and therefore, even though by the wallets, when they're two separate wallets, the Chacham would say that it's an entirely different wallet and the two wallets went away. By the birds, it's the same 2 out of 3 birds, just because one of them hopped away. So Hainu, the Itzrich l'shanui hocha, that's why we had to answer by the birds to say, do not compare the birds to the wallets, that even though by the wallets, when you find one wallet with $100, it's entirely different. But Shani Gozalos, it's different by the birds. Hov Asuin Ledados, since they move around, it makes sense to say that just one of them left, and what you're witnessing is 2 out of the 3 that are remaining. Masha'en came by the wallet, that, wallets don't go anywhere on their own. Somebody would have to chop them, and somebody chopped both wallets, and replaced it with a wallet of chulin. But if you say that the machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim is only by when the money is all in one wallet, that when you have $200 in one wallet, the Chachamim say, look, if you find $100 in there, it doesn't make any sense. Somebody would have chopped the entire wallet and replaced it with a separate wallet, whereas Rebbe says, no, somebody went into the wallet and removed the $100, and what you're seeing is still Meiser Sheni money. But when there are 2 wallets, and you had, right, if we say that when there are 2 wallets, and you had $100 in one wallet and $100 in the other wallet, and now you come back and find just one wallet with $100, if we say, right, according to the opinion that we say, that everyone would agree in that case that what you're experiencing is somebody took one of the wallets and left the other wallet, and it's definitely Meiser Sheni. So if that's the case, then by the birds also, we would apply the same thing to the birds. If already by the wallets, we know that the opinion of the rabbis is that when you have 2 separate wallets, and now you find only one wallet, we can assume that it's Meiser Sheni money. So then Memele, if we apply that to the birds as well, if you had 3 birds, and now you find 2 birds, just like by the wallets, when you had 2 wallets and now there's one wallet, we assume that this one wallet is, was initially one of the 2 originals. So then also, when you have 3 birds and one goes away, we can assume that the 2 are of the originals. And then Memele, I can eat them on yuntif. I don't need the reason of the birds hopping around. I already know from the situation of the Meiser Sheni that whenever you have 2 separate wallets, or in this case 3 separate birds, if one of them goes missing, you can assume that what remains are the remainders from the originals. So why do I need this separate reason of birds moving around? Why do I need to have this reason of the birds moving around? We said that when it comes to Meiser Sheni, everyone agrees, the Chachamim agree, that when you have 2 separate wallets, each one had $100, now you find one wallet with $100, you can assume that, okay, somebody just chopped one of the wallets and left the other one. So also by the 3 birds, we'll assume that one of them went away, and the 2 that you're seeing are 2 out of the 3 that are remaining. And I don't need the reason of, birds move around a lot. So Amar Rav Ashi, ha'acha b'gozalos mikusharim v'kisim mikusharim askinon. No, so we could say that when it comes to the wallets, and the Chacham say that when you have $100 in 2 wallets, one, right, meaning $100 in one wallet and another $100 in another wallet, and they say that even the Chachamim agree that when they're in 2 wallets, if you come back and you only find one wallet with $100 in it, you can assume that that's Meiser Sheni money. That's only when the wallets were not tied to each other. The wallets were not tied to each other, and therefore if somebody chopped one of the wallets and now you come back and there's one wallet left, you can assume that it's one of the two original wallets. But if the wallets were tied together, so then the Chacham would say that, somebody who's just chopping the wallets is going to chop both of the wallets. And therefore, if you apply that to birds, I would think that if you have birds that are tied together, and then you come back and there's only two of them, so mistama, they all flew away and these are separate. But the answer is, that's why you need the answer of, but birds move around, and even if they're tied together, you could still assume that one of them got away and these are the originals. So therefore, you can't necessarily learn out from the opinion of the rabbis, because from the opinion of the rabbis, by Meiser Sheni, I would only know that when the wallets are separate and they're not tied together, only when they're completely separate would I say that if you come back and find only one wallet, it's one of the two originals. But if they were tied together, I would assume that whoever chopped both of them, and this is a separate wallet. And therefore, if we apply that to birds, I would say that only when the birds are not tied together, if one flies away, would I assume that what we're seeing is the two out of the three remaining. But if the birds were tied together, and then I come back and only two of them are there, I would think that they're completely separate birds. So Kamash Malan, the thing about birds moving around, that no, even when they're tied together, still birds can move around, and it would still be the same two out of the three. Right? Ravashi, here, what we need, what we need, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar, to teach us that it's talking about birds moving around, is when we're talking about wallets that are tied together and birds that are tied together. That birds, even when they're tied together, they're still gonna, get out and wrangle their way out and leave, and therefore we can assume that one of them left, whereas wallets, when they're tied together, they're not going anywhere, and therefore if now you only find one, we can assume that somebody caught both of them because they were tied together, and this is a separate one. Whereas Rebbe would say, even by wallets, you can assume that even when they were tied together, if you find, they were both tied together, now you come back and find only one wallet, it's still one of the original two. Because Amalach, Kisanami, even by a wallet, sometimes the knot can get undone, and then they get separated, and then if somebody chops the wallet, they may have only chopped one of the wallets. Alright friends, that was Daf Yud. Daf 10 of Masechta Beitzah. Alright, so another kind of big Beitzah daf. The first part of the daf was kind of like trying to ask questions about Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, based on if, Beis Shammai is lenient, Beis Hillel is stringent, or vice versa. We basically ended up being able to explain all their opinions in each case, rather than to kind of say that it's global opinions and how we have to fit them into saying, well, Beis Shammai has to be lenient, Beis Hillel has to be stringent, or vice versa. Then we got up to a new Mishnah where Beis Shammai says that in order to eat birds from a dovecote on Yom Tiv, you have to, before Yom Tiv Mamish, go up and pick up the birds that you're planning to eat. Whereas Beis Hillel says it's enough to just verbalize Reuven and Shimon the bird, I'm going to eat you. Rav Chanan Bar Ami said that this machlokas is specifically by the first brood of the season, because generally you would leave the first brood for the mother dove. But so therefore, I might think that Beis Shammai says, look, you need to mamish pick up the birds, because if you don't mamish pick up the birds, you might change your mind to leave them for the mother. Whereas Beis Hillel says, no, it's enough just to specify that you want Reuven and Shimon the bird. Then the Gemara asked, but even according to Beis Hillel, why don't they just say Breira? Right? Why do you have to specifically say, I'm going to eat Reuven the bird and Shimon the bird? Why isn't it enough to just say, I'm going to chop two birds? And then Memele, when you chop two birds the next day, we'll say Breira, we'll say retroactively that these are the two birds that you intended. So Rav and Rabbi Oshaya say that Beis Hillel doesn't hold a Breira, and therefore that's why he has to specify Reuven and Shimon. Rav says that Beis Hillel Taka does hold a Breira. However, here, even if we're going to say Breira, there's still another concern, which is that unless he specifies Reuven and Shimon the bird, he might end up kind of picking up all of them to kind of figure out which is the best one, and then he's going to be picking things up for no reason, which will be which we don't want to do. Then we got to a new Mishnah about if you kind of specify black birds and then they're white birds and black birds and two birds and three birds and three birds and two birds. Okay, so Seder. So in those cases, you have to assume that they're different birds. However, in the case of when there were initially three birds and now you find two birds, so we can assume that one of them flew away and you can use these two. Now the question was, How does that tie into the machlokas between Rebbe and the Chacham when it comes to Meiser Sheni? That if you have $200 of Meiser Sheni, and then you find that there's only $100 of Meiser Sheni, Rebbe says that you can assume that this is $100 of Meiser Sheni. I'm sorry, initially you had $200 of Meiser Sheni, but now find $100. Rebbe says you can assume that it's Meiser Sheni, whereas the Chacham say that you have to assume that it's Chulin. So does that mean that that this mission is Dafka Rebbe? Because we're saying that if one of them flies away, you can assume that the remaining two are two of the original three. So the Gemara says, no, you can even assume that the Chacham would agree in this case, because since, birds kind of move around and stuff, so you can assume that one of them just kind of like moved around, but the two that are remaining are nonetheless remaining. We'll go into some other details of how to explain it, but that's, I think, the main gist over here. Okay, fine. So, okay, I guess, we can go a little further and say, meaning that the nafkamina is really that, right, that the Chacham would say that when it comes to wallets, if they're kind of tied up to each other, so then we would assume that if you chop one, you chop both. Whereas birds, even if they're tied up to each other, because birds kind of move around, so then you can assume that the two that you're seeing are two of the original three friends. That was Daf Yud of Masechta Beitzah. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.